So thank you everyone for joining us here. My name is Regan Shrumm, and this is the Open Access Workshop Organizing Accessibility from the Grassroots, facilitated by Vancouver-based artist Carmen Papalia. I'm so happy to see that this was at first in-person workshop that was going to be in Victoria, and now we have about 100 people registered throughout Canada, the US, and the United Kingdom. So that's very exciting. So I just want to first acknowledge that we have gathered digitally here on what the art gallery is on Lekwungen speaking people's lands and the WSÁNEĆ speaking people's lands. But because while we're thinking through this acknowledgement in a virtual way, I just want to take a moment and consider the legacy of colonization embedded within these technologies, structures, and ways of thinking and doing that we're currently using. We are using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. Even the technologies that are central to the arts that we're talking about here leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that are disproportionately affecting Indigenous peoples worldwide. I would like you to join me and acknowledge that we all are sharing this responsibility in making good of this time for each other to reconsider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship. And I also thinking about our current situations right now and what we're talking about in relation to Indigenous communities in Canada and across the world. So I am going to be your moderator. My name is Regan Shrumm. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. I am the assistant curator of the Art Gallery Grid Victoria. I am from Irish, German, Polish, English, and Scottish ancestry. And I have been living on the unceded and traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples and the WSÁNEĆ peoples for the past 10 years. So while I'm moderating this, if you have any trouble, the other moderator is also Duncan Ferguson. Thank you so much, Duncan. So you can either email Duncan or you can send a private message through the Zoom chat box. And just during this first part of the webinar, I just want to make sure that you have an understanding of Zoom. So please, you're going to be muted currently. If you would like to be unmuted to respond to something, please raise your hand, and either Duncan and I will assist with that. We will then let you speak. If you need to leave the webinar early, you can go on the corner on the lower right hand corner, and that will allow you to leave. You will be getting a recording of this later, so no problems if you need to leave early. If you're having any trouble with audio, please try the built-in speaker output. You can also phone in with this number. The one for Western Canada is 1-778-907-2071. With the webinar number is 866-105-358. And please remember, if you're using phone in, please mute your computer audio just in case. And today's presentation is conducted over a screen share, so you may want to adjust your view in Zoom. If you are using the captioning right now, you may want to also adjust so Zoom only takes up half your screen and the captioning takes up the other half. And within the next week or two, we'll be getting a follow-up email, just a link with this recording, a transcript, and also a feedback survey as well. Almost all done here. If you are interested in other AGGV accessibility programs, Carmen will be participating in another community conversation coming up here on Monday, April 27th, with also Victoria-based artist Parker Johnson. And that will be looking at the futurisms of arts accessibility. And then also on May 13th, we'll be looking at present day arts accessibility within Victoria, although these will be probably broader conversations now that these are in person. so we can really share of what's happening around the world. So now I'm going to introduce Carmen. Carmen is a social art practice, Carmen is a social practice artist who uses organizing strategies and improvisation to address his access to public space, the art institution, and visual culture. His work, which takes forms ranging from collaborative art, collaborative performance to public intervention, is an effort to unlearn visual primacy and resilience, resist support options that promote ableist concepts of normalcy. Papalia's work has been featured at the Solemn R. Guggenheim Museum in New York, the Tate Liverpool in Liverpool, the Grand Central Art Center in Santa Ana, and Gallery Gachet in Vancouver, among many others. And now on to you, Carmen.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Regan, and the art gallery, Greater Victoria, as well. I'm really glad that we were able to open this up to more folks, given the current restrictions. First off, though, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. It's a privilege to be able to, gather here and like this to talk about accessibility. I grew up here, and I'm currently sheltering with my family. And I'm talking to you from my bedroom, which is kind of my office now, because we have an under 2-year-old that's kind of has the run of the house right now. So yeah, we had to change the format a little bit today because, again, this was planned as like an in-person workshop where we could do like small group work and everything. But I'm going to give an artist talk and introduce you to the work that I've been doing over the last like 10 years. And then we're gonna have like some volunteers read a short piece that we're gonna discuss, and then I'm gonna share like an audio piece that kind of has clips of interviews with various folks that I've worked with in Vancouver's downtown east side and Chinatown. Yeah, and so I guess I'll just get right into it. I consider myself like a social practice artist or a socially engaged artist. I call myself a non-visual artist because I don't use words like blind or visually impaired to describe myself, because I use like my non-visual senses as a primary way of learning about my surroundings. So like I think words like blind and visually impaired still privilege the visual experience. So I kind of have distanced myself from that language since, kind of establishing an art practice. And yeah, I guess the first image that you're looking at right now is a project that I did in 2009. And this is before I thought of myself as an artist. At the time, I had just kind of adopted a white cane to detect obstacles. I wave it in front of me, tapping it back and forth, and I never really used it to identify myself necessarily, but I always felt uncomfortable with the way it identified me. So when I adopted a cane, I found that people would read my body and I would be immediately put into a separate category from my friends and my peers and my family. So I felt like it was more of like a distancing that I experienced with the cane. Also, I'd run into these situations where it would just like this invitation for people to ask me about like my life story in 5 minutes. They always wanted to know, like, they wanted to tell me about disabled folks in their lives as well. And sometimes this, they well-meaning sort of interactions where they would want to offer help to me, offer support, help me cross the street. And it just was like inviting a lot of this attention that was kind of more of an inconvenience for me. So like as soon as I started using a white cane, I started modifying it. And one of my first modifications was to strip all the white and red tape off the cane. And my first cane was a graphite cane too. So underneath it was black. Sorry, when the chat's going on, I hear a robotic voice reading out the chat to me. So yes, everybody sounds like a robot, um, unfortunately, through chat. Or maybe that's a good thing. Anyways, so I started modifying my cane to kind of like, I felt like what it did, me stripping all the white and red tape off my cane, was sort of like turn the volume onto turn the volume down on the message that the cane is constantly transmitting, which is like, this person needs help. And yeah, I wanted to disrupt that sort of interaction in some ways. And so in thinking through this experience about how the cane distanced me from others, I in 2009, I made this 15-foot mobility cane. So I'd go on walks with it. It's kind of a social distancing stick, I guess. You could think about it that way now. But people definitely did stay away from me when I was using this. I'd take up the entire sidewalk, tapping it from side to side. People would kind of jump out of my way. And you know, it was a bit of an antagonistic approach to really thinking through my own access, I guess. And it was coming at a point where I was also frustrated with, like, I was learning how to navigate, you know, walking routes, and I was constantly bumping into things, and I was kind of frustrated about the way that the city was designed and how it definitely you know, was not conducive to like my ease of access. And so I was almost like doing this to like become like a moving obstacle for other people to have to navigate. Yeah, and it almost just like, I would say, like expanded the force field that was already around me when I was using a white cane. Usually people stayed away from me, and I think the cane, there's this dynamic to it where it almost like acts like a magnet and a repellent at the same time. It like draws people towards you in this uncomfortable way, but it also pushes people away. And Regan, if you could go to the next image. So this is a project I did in 2013, and it was after a conversation that I had with my best friend in Portland, where I was just thinking of the various things. We were just going back and forth thinking of the various things I could replace my cane with. And we landed on this idea of replacing my cane with a marching band. So and it was just a jokey sort of conversation that we had this ongoing sort of exchange about. And eventually I told this to I shared about this with a curator at the Grand Central Art Center in Santa Ana, California, and I said, and you know, I told him about replacing my cane with the marching band, and about a week later he came back to me, emailed me with, like, you know, told me about 5 marching bands that he had talked to who were interested. Uh-oh. Can I get confirmation that you all can hear me still? Oh, okay, cool. Thank you. I don't know why Regan, oh, darn, sorry about the captions too. Duncan, I wonder if that's something you're working on. And Regan, do you think she just dropped from like the internet wise, or what's the deal? Well, if you can all hear me still, let's wait. I mean, like, let's not spend too much time. I can just tell you about my work, and when the slideshow comes back, I can we can follow along.
Just a moment, Carmen. I'm refraining from typing into the chat because I can tell it's difficult for you to speak and have the robot voice going on at the same time.
Right.
So Regan is in charge of the captioning, and so
Okay.
we're just discussing that right now.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Yes.
So I suppose continue as you were, and we'll get back to
right. Okay. We'll link up with the image that are corresponding to what I'm talking about. But basically, in 2013, I got this. Yeah. So basically, the curator called my bluff and you know, provided me with this like list of 5 marching bands that were interested in working with me. And they were all high school marching bands from the Santa Ana area in California. And I ended up getting along with this one marching band really well. We kind of carried on this correspondence over Skype over 6 months, and they just kind of asked me questions about my routines, my walking routes, the kinds of things I bump into, you know, how I approach crossing a street, all these things. And then they went off and made musical cues to indicate some of these things. And then, you know, before the performance, like the day before, we had this like really quick rehearsal in the high school parking lot. And we just kind of played out various scenarios, like, you know, let's pretend that I'm walking onto a busy street. What happens now? And then the, you know, marching band director would kind of direct band members to where they needed to be. So where maybe I was like encountering an obstacle or something, and then there would be like a big cymbal crash or something. Hey, Regan's back.
Hi, I'm back.
Hi. We're still on the marching band image with the high school marching band. Yeah, so we kind of worked out these scenarios, and then we just did this like completely improvised process where I just like walked through downtown Santa Ana, which I had no like sense of prior to this this performance. And through this improvised process, I just like found myself in you know, my way into restaurants, art galleries, an underground parking structure, all while the band was responding to and trying to anticipate where I was going. And yeah, and so Regan, you can continue with the next few images. So last year in September, I had the opportunity to do this project. Is called Mobility Device. If you want to see a video of that performance with the high school marching band, it's on YouTube. It's called Mobility Device. I had this opportunity to work with the High Line in New York City, and in 2017, I kind of started this correspondence with another band, a Brooklyn-based band called the Hungry March Band, who've been playing together for over 12 years. They started playing shows on the occasion of the Mermaid Parade at Coney Island. And they kind of advertised themselves as like a marching band that would play any gig. So I kind of challenged them on that and said, okay, well, this is what I want to do. And they were up for it. So over, you know, since, I don't know, we had a bunch of rehearsals. I would go back and forth to New York City, and we'd spend time in studio, kind of doing this similar thing to what I did with the high school marching band, where we would just like play out different scenarios, and then that they would find various strategies for addressing things that we might encounter in public space. And yeah, then we kind of like played outside a bit, and then finally brought our operation to the High Line, where I navigated you know, over 2 nights, 2 evenings, with the band as my navigation system. Yeah, and yeah, I have plans. I actually had plans to do Mobility Device in London in September, but those have been delayed. And we could go to the next image now. It should be me with a megaphone. It says saying like, I can't see you.
Yep.
Yeah. And okay, so this is another like project about the cane and my mobility. And I would say also about like, you know, what a public's responsibility to, you know, to care for those in need might be. And that's what a lot of my work is about accessibility and, you know, how we care for people in times of need. So with this project, it's called White Cane Amplified, and I just did this kind of as a process for myself. Like it was just like a private sort of thing that I did, no audience or anything, but just with a small like camera crew to document it. And what I did is I dropped my cane and I replaced my cane with a megaphone that I used to just like identify myself and hail support from passersby. So, you know, and I really thought of this project as like me reclaiming the social function of the cane. So like, instead of letting the cane like speak for me, really kind of like speak for myself and use the language that I use to describe myself. So, you know, literally like in this performance, in this process, I was like, I'm a non-visual learner. I can't see you. Hopefully you can see me. Hopefully I don't bump into you. And just kind of like making my presence known, but then also just like finding my way at a at a crosswalk, and just like, you know, putting that call out to the people around me, you know, that I might need some help crossing the street, and just having to wait there, I guess, until someone responded. Yeah, and I've reperformed that performance a few times so far, in different places. But usually I just use it as like, I choose a destination for where I want the performance to end. And then I kind of try to get there with public support. So it's like completely improvised. And we could go to the next image. This is from a project I did in 2015 with this engineering college just outside of Boston called Olin College of Engineering. And I was invited to, as part of this series called Investigating Normal. And it was really to like this call to folks in the disability community to develop like an assistive device around their terms. So the designer that invited me is named Sarah Hendren. And she has this adaptive and assistive technologies lab at Olin College. And she really like embraces this design for one sort of philosophy, and so instead of like trying to make the next like consumer object, or you know, the next iPhone, something that everybody would want, she kind of interviews the people who will be using the object that she's designing, and really get like what their hopes for usability are, and really just have the the object kind of suit that person's needs, the user's needs. And so when she asked me like what I was interested in doing, I was really thinking through the white cane and my kind of relationship with it since I started using one. And so we decided to develop an alternative to the white cane. And so in a similar you know, process with the marching band, actually, I kind of like, her students interviewed me about like, again, like what my position on the cane was, you know, my walking routes, all these things, what my, you know, how I like interacting with the world around me. And then I kind of visited the campus, and I took students on walks with their eyes closed, and gave a couple talks there too, and then we engaged in this process where we just kind of like explored the topic of the white cane, and through design and various like iterative processes. And what you're looking at now is like the studio image where like students are broken up into teams, and they're just kind of developing alternative canes. And one of them was like this vest. I wear vests a lot. Might see them in some of my documentation, but it was a vest that had these kind of like cat-like whiskers coming out of it that would feel different obstacles and give me like haptic feedback. These were very like basic prototypes, so they weren't like, you know, they weren't working devices. They're just kind of being pieced together for concept. The one that I'm using in the image is this one group who they just kind of used what they had access to in their dorm rooms, and they had like a bunch of guitar equipment, guitar amp, looping pedal, distortion pedal, and all these things, and they just kind of like you know, rigged my cane up in such a way so there was like a contact mic on the bottom, and then that sound, like I could drag my cane on the ground and it would pretty much like translate texture to sound, and then that that sound would be output onto speakers that I could, you know, and then I could also use the pedals as well to play around with those sounds. And it was super fun to use. So we kind of like continued on that track of exploring this idea of like the cane that translates texture into sound. Regan, there's the next image, or sorry, the next piece is a short video, and it's so the students ended up making like a list of 400 conceptual cane ideas, and they were not all realized, but you know, they ranged from, say, a single-use cane that would break or that you would have to dispose of after you used it, to like a cane that left you know, a trail of ink. And this cane was one on the list, and it was called the Wander cane, and it was a cane with a mind of its own that would take the user where it wanted to go instead of allowing the user to have agency. So we're just going to watch, and I would get these videos from students like every month or so, and they were just like them playing with these ideas in studio, and we're just going to watch the short video now.
And there we go.
No, come back, kids, come back.
Kids, children, children.
Oh no.
Oh!
Yeah, so it kind of broke apart, but yeah, that was the Wander cane. The next video is one of the students working in a studio and like working on the modulation device. So the device that kind of like produces the sound, and he's working on like, oh, video's a bit choppy, sorry about that. Yeah, the next video is, it's more of a sound sort of based video, so hopefully that comes through all right. But yeah, so the student's just working on the modulation device.
Oh, that's the same video. Sorry, I think that was the same video, Carmen, I put in.
Okay.
Do
you have the other one? Or?
No? I don't think so, but I have the third one.
Oh, okay, okay. So, oh, I think that is the second one.
No, that is the second one. Okay.
Yeah,
I just
yeah.
the first one. There you go.
It might be hard to hear, but it's just the delay sort of echoey sort of sound that the cane's making, and the students just triggering it. Another student saying that it's annoying. So anyways, yeah, this is very much the culture of the campus. The students are, sorry, I'm just getting thrown off by the chat. Don't refrain from using the chat though. You could switch to the next video. So the next video is just another student using the cane the sound cane once it was like more to a usable state. Yeah, that was more of like, that sound was coming in a bit more clear, and it was more of like a lightsaber effect, I would say. But yeah, there's so much of a range with the modulation device. I get, you know, pretty much you just, oh, you could probably see it actually, next image. They kind of like repurpose those like Fender guitar pedals and all that stuff. And it's supposed to be it's supposed to be portable. It has like a belt thing that I can attach it to my belt, but it's a little bit heavy, a bit cumbersome. We're planning to work on a new version of the cane that would be a little more streamlined, and a version that I could just plug into any audio setup, and so like I could work with a composer or a musician who could like live mix the sounds that I'm producing. You could go to the next image now. Is this my walking tour image?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the
Oh, cool. Okay. So this is a project that I've been doing since 2010, where I take groups of people on walks where they close their eyes and link arms and line up behind me. And I take them on like about an hour-long walk through cities and rural areas as well. And I've taken groups of up to like 90 people on these walks, where you could imagine if it's a group that large, we really kind of disrupt public space. I think of these walks as like not really like a, you know, a simulation of my experience or like a walk in my shoes, but like more of a like intentional time spent with eyes closed. So an opportunity to exercise your non-visual senses, you know, something that we don't often take time to do. And yeah, you know, I started leading these walks when I moved to Portland to go to grad school in 2010. And I was in this place where I was learning like a whole new set of walking routes. And once I learned these various, like how to navigate these places, I wanted to kind of share. I mean, they became my like that was my sense of place, and I felt like this yeah, I was interested in bringing other people into that space, into that process. So I just kind of one day asked my classmates to meet me in front of the art building and line up behind me and close their eyes. And I didn't really tell them what we were going to do, but I took them on an hour-long walk through the city, and yeah, that was the beginning of it. And then I started just putting that call out to the public, and I would, advertise on like Craigslist and Facebook, and I would just say like, if you want to learn how to walk with your eyes closed, show up at this place at this time. And being Portland, people, like a good group of people would show up. Yeah, and those are some of my first walks. And the walk that you're looking at now is from Haverford College in 2013. For that walk, I chose a destination of where I wanted the walk to end, and that was and I think if you were to walk from where we started to the destination and you knew where you were going, you'd probably take 5 minutes to get there. But I didn't know where we were. I chose to approach the walk as an improvised process with everybody involved, and just problem solve my way there to the destination. And for us, it took an hour and 45 minutes to finally get to the destination. But I was pretty happy because the next day I cut my time by an hour and got to that same place. But yeah, I think that the route that I take and my approach to, piecing together a route really changes based on where I'm leading these walks. I've led them all over the place now. The next image is an image from the California College of the Arts in San Francisco campus, where, it was the first time a lot of people showed up for my walk, and these are students from the California College of the Arts. Next image is, I think, a walk from New York a few years ago. And then the final image here is this image, again, from the California College of the Arts. And I think on one hand, while this work is, I think this project is about, kind of like creating a space for non-visual learning, non-visual, ways of navigating our surroundings and understanding our surroundings. It really is about a group of people coming together and like modeling a support network, because people are, naturally kind of aware of what's going on around them, and like telling others about that. So, I deliver information from the front of the line, and every second person repeats it. But then there's also this like informal sort of like, oh, I just like, I encountered that first step down, and people are just telling the person behind them, or, just, it's a really, it's interesting how like, maybe in the first 10, 15 minutes, people are super uncomfortable and like still figuring out how to walk with their eyes closed. But by the end of the hour-long walk, like it really becomes this responsive support network. You could go to the next image. So in 2013, I had this opportunity to do a few projects about non-visual learning in the museum at like the Guggenheim, the Whitney, and MoMA. And a lot of the museums at that time, those museums were doing work about like the senses. And at the Guggenheim, I was able to work with the Mind's Eye program, which is through the education department. And it's like this, it kind of like caters to the low vision and blind community. And it's this interesting program because like it, you know, I guess like it's unique in insofar that like the programs that it offers and the things that it kind of takes on as initiatives are like directly relate to things that the community has told them that they want. So so you know, I was invited here to like make a project on the invitation of the group, that the Mind's Eye group. And I proposed this project called The Touchy Subject, which is about tactility and touching art objects in the museum. And so through this project, I negotiated for like tactile access to certain works in the collection. And then I spent time with education staff members, and we like spent time developing this methodology for like touching these objects and like, you know, finding out like what we could learn about them with eyes closed. And then also developing like terminology and vocabulary for like describing what we felt. And then there was a series of public tours offered. Yeah, so there was these public tours. There were one-on-one tours with an education staff member, where the visitor, whoever was, you know, the tour being toured around, could shut their eyes and link arms with an education staff member, and their hand would be directed to tactile points of interest. So that included the building itself. It included objects from the collection that we had been working with that were open for touching as well. And also there's that closeness between the guide and the person being guided. And what you're seeing is a person being touching this point on the floor in the rotunda of the Guggenheim. There's like 2 dots there. Once the world kind of like opens up again, and people, I don't know if you ever find yourself in New York at the Guggenheim, there's this amazing little architectural detail where, you know, if you stand at a certain point in the rotunda and project your voice, like your voice kind of just like encompasses you, it surrounds you, and it kind of like resonates in this interesting way. We could go to the next image.
Yep, and there's about 5 more minutes from when you first planned.
Oh no. Okay, I'll get through this quickly, hopefully. What is this, a poster?
No, this is you putting a red line.
Okay, maybe I'll skip that then.
Okay.
Next image.
Poster? Oh no, okay. It's at the one where people are laying down.
Okay, yeah. So this is from a project, a residency that I did in Ireland, where I just like made projects that responded to my own access. And this one was, or to my experience of the space. So this was a gallery that I encountered where there was just like a bunch of paintings that were like from the permanent collection that were hung at a typical height for like a standing viewer. And I requested that they all be lowered so they're only inches from the ground. And in order to like trouble that, you know, kind of like maybe typical access, or the access that the institution was catering to. And you know, while kind of disrupting the just passive experience of viewing art in the museum, where, you know, we usually kind of just wander through these spaces and maybe spend, I think the number is like maybe 20 seconds at each piece. But this kind of like required the viewer to like problem solve their way to comfortably view the work. And that meant for them to get close to the ground and crouch and crawl. And you know, it also opened up, being that low, opened up access for kids and wheelchair users and a bunch of other folks too. So yeah, next image. So this is a poster from a project I did in 2015 with Gallery Gachet in Vancouver. Gallery Gachet is in Vancouver's downtown East Side neighborhood. It's a collectively run space with like a mandate around demystifying issues relating to mental health. It's been active in the community for over 20 years and kind of has remained like an open space for residents in the neighborhood and yeah, and I felt like it was maybe an ideal place for me to think through accessibility as like a living practice, because I really think that at Gallery Gachet, accessibility is an ongoing process. It's changing with the people who are involved with the space at any given time. It changes with the politics of those folks, the social environment they create together. And there's very few spaces like that in Vancouver, I noticed. And the only other one that I really had the privilege to be part of was the Purple Thistle Center that's not around anymore, but it was like a youth run space that was collectively run by youth participants. But at Gallery Gachet, what I ended up doing was I gathered a group of people together that were just kind of friends that all kind of were thinking through accessibility from different perspectives. So like not everybody identified as disabled. So some identified as MAD, as were thinking through their experience of accessibility from from their position being Indigenous or trans or a young person. There are some actually youth participants from the Purple Thistle Center that joined in this process too. And what we did is we just kind of had like weekly meetings about accessibility and just tried to develop sort of like, a framework to assess an institution. And the institution that we wanted to assess was the Vancouver Art Gallery, which is, situated, well, it's a former courthouse building that still, I think, holds a lot of that colonial history. And so a lot of the artists I was working with felt like outsiders in relation to that space and felt unwelcome there. So we were just kind of setting us, we were all thinking about accessibility from our individual perspectives and just like using that experience to interpret the space. And we would do, and we made an exhibition as a result. And one of the pieces that we worked on together is the next image here. It's a wall panel that we actually found at the art gallery, Vancouver Art Gallery, when we were visiting one day. And as you do, we just kind of gathered around this one piece. It was describing an exhibition of photos by a Canadian photographer named Christos Dikikos. And it was a show that was curated by the associate director and chief curator of the institution as well. And this series of photos was depicting like art and objects made by Indigenous artists without any context as to who made the object, who the artists were, what the objects were, and in some cases too, there were objects that actually, through protocol should not be depicted in a photograph. And so we just, kind of gathered around this wall text and started reading it aloud. And it became, pretty clear that it was misrepresenting colonization. It referred to, first contact as like an exchange between cultures. And so we started to think about like, given that we were talking about accessibility from various perspectives, and we're talking about indigeneity in relation to accessibility, and we thought about like, what would this text look like if it was edited by folks at Gachet. So we kind of just like reproduced the wall panel and opened that process up to folks at Gallery Gachet, and they provided sort of the decolonial narrative that wasn't available at the gallery. So that's what you're kind of seeing in red corrective marker. And the next image is a detail shot. So you could see how people were offering the traditional name for certain place names, like False Creek. They're also just calling out the exchange between cultures as genocide. And also, you know, and we thought, like, you know, while you might just kind of like pass by this wall panel at the gallery and not think too much of it, we really thought that it was pointing to what the politics of people who are decision makers at the institution were around, you know, and I guess what involvement with local Indigenous communities was, what the state of that relationship was. So we really thought it was kind of revealing of the institution in many ways. And yeah, and our whole process was kind of like this unsolicited accessibility audit of the Vancouver Art Gallery that we felt like, you know, we kind of, yeah, it was done without an invitation by the institution, through necessity, I think. Next image. After, I know I'm going a little over, but sorry. So just after that show about the Vancouver Art Gallery came down, I kind of like went on the road and started sharing the framework that that we were using to assess the Vancouver Art Gallery with other institutions, and just like sharing about our process with them. And around the time that I hosted that gathering at the Vancouver at the Gallery Gachet, I wrote this set of 5 guiding principles, which I called open access. And at the time, it was really just a way for me to describe my own position on the topic of accessibility. And really, it kind of like frames accessibility a lot differently than we usually talk about it. And maybe, yeah, sorry, I kind of switched things around a bit here, but I do have that statement and a few volunteers here that that are going to read it aloud. And I'm just gonna, it's five short paragraphs, and it describes accessibility. It describes accessibility as an ongoing practice of mutual care.
And I'm just going to allow our volunteers to talk. So Josh. Nino. Okay.
And so I call this like a manifesto, but also like a conceptual framework in some ways. And I've used it in various ways and applied it in various ways to make like projects and also just to like introduce like a new, like to establish like a new context for conversations about accessibility and public engagement at various institutions. So
if I'll start reading this, and then I'll get Michelle to continue with the next. So in 2015, artist Carmen Papalia.
You can just start with the principles,
okay.
Like just with the, yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay. Sure, I'll do this first one. Open access relies on those present, what their needs are, and how they can find support with each other and in their communities. It is a perpetual negotiation of trust between those who practice support as a mutual exchange.
Thank you.
Michelle, if you want to go.
Sure. Open access is radically different than a policy that temporarily removes a barrier to participation for a group with definitive needs. It acknowledges that everyone carries a body of local knowledge and is an expert in their own right.
Thanks.
Lino?
Open access is the root system of embodied learning. It cultivates trust among those involved and enables each member to self-identify and occupy a point of orientation that centers complex embodiment.
Thank you.
And Joshua?
Open access disrupts the disabling conditions that limit one's agency and potential to thrive. It reimagines normalcy as a continuum of embodiments, identities, realities, and learning styles, and operates under the tenet that interdependence is central to a radical restructuring of power.
And then let's see if I can read this last one. There we go. Open access is a temporary collective held space where participants can find comfort in disclosing their needs and preferences with one another. It is responsive support that adapts as needs are available and available resources change.
Thank you. And so that statement, I think, really describes like my position on the topic of accessibility, but it also, I think it's something that, you know, while I articulated it in 2015, it really has been like, it describes my way of working as an artist. And I think you can see sort of some of those dynamics at play in projects like the walking tour, as well as in like the marching band performance and even, you know, maybe with the megaphone piece as well. My final images, I just want to show you a couple of images of current work. So last year I had this show at the Banff Center and I had the opportunity to make 2 new works. And I developed this animation that kind of is about open access and also like my many, you know, times in hospital since childhood and kind of like my thoughts on the medical model. And yeah, and it was a collaboration with animator named Heather Kai Smith. And yeah, this is a still from that animation. And the next, sorry, is that correct? Are we on the still? Oh, okay, cool.
So it was the still and now it's to the installation.
Yeah, and so it was presented with this installation that I made called Ocular Centrism, and that's like, you know, ocular centrism, you know, is kind of describes a culture, a valuing system that kind of specifically oriented around visual experience. And so it creates like this disorienting visual environment with the mirrored surfaces, and all these pillars are kind of like placed at a 30, 60, or 90-degree angle to like create these like kind of yeah, this confusing visual environment. All right, and I think that's it. That's it for my artist talk, at least. I guess I'd maybe open it up for questions and take questions for a few minutes, and then we could get on to our next activity.
And we actually already have a question that came in earlier.
Okay.
So it says our organization is talking about ways to reduce tactile experiences in the museum as a response to COVID-19 once we open up again. Tactile experiences are important for access. Do you have recommendations of how we can keep people safe while still allow people to touch?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what I was really trying to get at with those projects, and I'm continuing to do work about tactility now, and I think it really like falls into that category of like learning with the non-visual senses and like privileging of the visual sense, and you know, pushing against that tradition of ocular centrism, and I think, you know, in the interest of opening access up. So, you know, and I think of these experiences as like having access to an object and the ability to touch it as I feel like that activity is, it's interesting because like in the museum context, like museum history is completely centered around, you know, visual interpretation, and even in the way that they museums catalog objects. It's all about visual characteristics. I really thought like of these projects at the point that I made them as like, you know, we're opening up a different space, a place, you know, a space that potentially like, you know, could uncover or like reveal new ways of interpreting collected art objects. With coronavirus though, and I mean, like, I really haven't processed this time yet and what it means for museums. And I think it's tough to say. Like, I would say that description can create a very immersive experience if done in a good way. Like visual description can be very immersive. But yeah, with touch, I don't know, we can't touch so many things already. And I would say if they're just like sweeping rules now around like, oh, we can't really touch things in the museum for health reasons too, like that space will completely be restricted, and it might. Oh, okay. Sorry, is there another question before I respond to the one that just came in through chat?
No, but I'll read it aloud just in case people
Okay.
Chat. So how have museum staff and non-disabled individuals responded to your work, especially work at Gallery Gachet?
Yeah, so I feel like I get asked this a lot, and my initial interest in making work and like starting to work as an artist was to address an uninformed non-disabled audience. So like I really was trying to, with my cane adaptations, all of these things are pointing at dynamics and barriers that I was experiencing that I felt were like, you know, a result of ableism. And so, you know, even I would say that the touchy subject in this work about tactility, I think it definitely speaks to the museum as an ableist, you know, like institution. And I think in non-disabled folks, like there still is that sort of like, I mean, I think a lot of institutions, especially so-called public institutions, we could call our institution public, but is it really public and welcoming for everybody? Usually, those institutions want to try to cater to their to underrepresented groups, and so when there's work that engages these topics, I think there's always folks that are going to be listening. But like, I guess what my interest is now that I get to, you know, okay. Yeah, I think when there's an what's interesting for me now is carrying on more longer term engagements with like the institutions I work with. So the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina, for example, I've been working with them for a couple years now, and I visit them multiple times a year. We continue our conversation about accessibility around the terms that, you know, of open access, rather than just like, you know, a policy that's implemented from the top down. You know, it's not just, I feel, yeah, there's been a great response, I think, to the proposals that I've made in these institutions, but also with that collective work through Gallery Gachet. You know, the director of the institution who had curated that show and wrote that wall text, like eventually reached out to me and asked if I could talk to, you know, the curatorial staff there, and I kind of like suggested that everybody that conducted the audit should be invited in to talk to staff, and they should also be compensated for that. So eventually our conversation kind of, you know, fell yeah, it just fell away, and we didn't really go further than that. So, you know, I really think it's on the institution to kind of like dedicate time, space, and resources to these topics. And it's, you know, the museum has been it started out as a colonial project, so it still carries those histories. It is a colonial enterprise. So I think when changes are proposed, like they need to be led by folks who are underrepresented. People need to, you know, who from historically marginalized groups need to be given time, space, and resources to make proposals, to, you know, address harmful histories if they want to take that work on. So it's a complicated thing to, you know, move these conversations forward. There's a question that came in about public art and making public art accessible. Yeah, public art should be like public, obviously, but I think there's, you know, I know a lot of folks who work in New York City too, around the Percent for Art program, and a lot of work that is commissioned through these, you know, public art programs in cities. You know, they try to kind of like follow accessibility guidelines, but like the accessibility changes and so contextual and so local. So like I feel like you really have to do an assessment that really includes folks that are from the community in which the work is placed. And if you don't have the choice to do that because it's already an existing work, I think it's bringing in people who could speak to that work, and in order to open up the conversation around it. So like I'm thinking of work that my friend Aslan Thomas did, who's an artist out of Kitchener, who was working at the Banff Center this summer and did a and developed a tour of all of the public art on campus. All the sculptural work on the Banff Center campus, and a lot of the tour was kind of like involved descriptions by poets and writers, and descriptions of work, and sometimes they focused on everything around the work, and just were various like found various other ways to connect the viewer to the space, to the land, to the histories that and contexts that might not have been just like available through the work itself, or just on first glance.
So Carmen, it's just 3 minutes past 2 right now. We do have another question that came in, but I was wondering if you want to save that for later and go on to the Mingus piece, or?
Yeah, maybe we can go into the Mia Mingus piece. So I will take a question. We'll have more time to talk throughout this. So the next piece that I wanted to share with everybody is called access intimacy. It's a term that disabled activist Mia Mingus proposed, and Mia Mingus was part of the disability justice collective, kind of like coined the concept or established this concept of disability justice, which is kind of like a way of looking at like art and culture, and just kind of like describes that you know, all forms of repression are intertwined, and that, you know, among those, like ableism is the thing that strengthens, I would say, lots of other forms of oppression as well, like racism and colonialism and sexism. So yeah, so we're going to read this short piece. There's a few volunteers that are going to take turns reading it aloud. It's a short piece too, so it should take maybe 10 minutes to read aloud. Then we'll chat about it. And I thought access intimacy would be a great thing to introduce now, because I think we're in this moment right now where folks are thinking about how to, you know, how to respond, and also just like how to be together in a good way while being isolated. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in this piece, and I hope folks connect to it as well.
And thank you for reading this out loud. Yeah. We're gonna share screen. Okay, and I'll start with these two paragraphs, then I'll put it on to Michelle for reading the next slide. So it starts as, there are many ways to describe intimacy. For example, there's physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, intellectual, political, familiar, or sexual intimacy. But as a physical disabled woman, there is another kind of intimacy I have been struggling to name and describe, what I have been calling access intimacy. I have begun using the term loosely and still realizing different aspects of it. This is in no way a complete describing of it. Instead, this is an initial naming and the beginnings of giving it shape. I am offering it as something that has been useful for me, and I hope it is useful to others to describe all different kinds of access, not just in relation to disability. I think access as a framework is powerful for so many of our lives. Here, I am speaking for my own lived experience as a physical disabled person, but I know access intimacy can also happen in many different ways for mamas and parents, women of color, queer and trans folks, etc. Anyone can experience access intimacy.
I have never had words for access intimacy before. For years, I would feel it or crave it, but not know how to describe it. It has always been just out of reach, just beyond my grasp. I have mistaken it for emotional or political intimacy, sexual attraction, or romantic desire. I have mistakenly assumed that it would be there based on one's identity or experience. I have grappled with how to describe the closeness I would feel with people who my disabled body just felt a little bit safer and at ease with. There have been relationships that carried emotional, physical, and political intimacy, but sorely lacked access intimacy. And there have been relationships where access intimacy has helped to create the conditions out of which emotional, familial, and political intimacy could grow.
Thank you, Michelle. And on to Lino.
Access intimacy is that elusive, hard to describe feeling when someone else gets your access needs. The kind of eerie comfort that your disabled self feels when with someone on a purely access level. Sometimes it can happen with complete strangers, disabled or not, or sometimes it can be built over years. It could also be the way your body relaxes and opens up with someone when all of your access needs are being met. It is not dependent on someone having a political understanding of disability, ableism, or access. Some of the people I have experienced the deepest access intimacy with, especially able-bodied people, have had no education or exposure to a political understanding of disability.
Thank you, Lino, and on to Joshua.
Access intimacy is also the intimacy I feel with many other disabled and sick people who have an automatic understanding of access needs out of our shared similar lived experience of the many different ways ableism manifests in our lives. Together, we share a kind of access intimacy that is ground level, with no need for explanations. Instantly, we can hold the weight, emotion, logistics, isolation, trauma, fear, anxiety, and pain of access. I don't have to justify, and we are able to start from a place of steel vulnerability. It doesn't mean that our access looks the same or that we even know what each other's access needs are. It has taken the form of long walks into the night upon our first meeting, knowing glances shared across a room, or in a group of able-bodied people, or the feeling of instant familiarity to be able to ask for help or support.
Thank you, Joshua. In my life, access intimacy is something that has been hard-won, organic, or at times even felt magical. It has taken me by surprise, showing up with people that I never would have expected to have that kind of access connection with. It has been exciting and relieving, like a long, slow inhale. I didn't know where it comes from or how it happens. It has felt like an unspoken instinctual language between different people, like an entirely unique way of being able to communicate and connect, similar to meeting someone you just click with. Access intimacy has felt like a distinct form of attraction, desire, and energy onto itself. Michelle, oh, thank you.
Sorry. Access intimacy is something I am coming to understand that I need in my life, something that I cannot and don't want to live without. I need it to literally be my whole self because access is such an intimate part of my life as a queer, physically disabled woman of color adoptee. Without it, relationships exist under a glass ceiling or split by thick frosted windows, with huge pieces of myself never being able to be reached. Without it, there is survival, but rarely true whole connection.
Access intimacy is not just the action of access or helping someone. We have all experienced access that has left us feeling like a burden, violated, or just plain shitty. Many of us have experienced obligatory access where there is no intimacy, just a stoic counting down of the seconds until it's over. This is not access intimacy. There have been numerous relationships in my life where I have loved people very deeply, but never fully felt safe with them around my access. So many relationships where I knew I could only ask for or share so much, without getting snapped at, chided, or being punished with reluctant, passive-aggressive access. So many times where I was too afraid, because of the lack of access intimacy, to speak up and voice what I needed or what I couldn't do, resulting in being isolated or getting very badly physically hurt from pushing myself too hard in some of the worst cases.
Access intimacy is not charity, resentfulness enacted, intimidation, a humiliating trade for survival, or an ego boost. In fact, all of this threatens and kills access intimacy. There is a good feeling after and while you are experiencing access intimacy. It is a freeing, light, loving feeling. It brings the people who are a part of it closer. It builds and deepens connection. Sometimes access intimacy doesn't even mean that everything is 100% accessible. Sometimes it looks like both of you trying to create access as hard as you can with no avail in an ableist world. Sometimes it is someone just sitting and holding your hand while you both stare back at an inaccessible world.
It has looked like relations where I always feel like I can say what my access needs are, no matter what. Or I can say that I don't know them, and that's okay too. It has looked like people not expecting payment in the form of emotional currency or ownership for access. It has looked like able-bodied people listening to me and believing me. It has looked like people investing in remembering my access needs and checking in with me if there are going to be situations that might be inaccessible or hard disability body-wise. It has looked like CRIP made access. It looked like CRIP solidarity.
In the last half decade of my life, I've been able to experience many different forms and levels of access intimacy. Before that, I was not even in a place where I could have had access intimacy with anyone. It has only been in the last 7 years that I have come into myself as a politically disabled person enough to begin to experience or desire access intimacy, even on superficial levels. Looking back, there have been only a handful of relationships in my life where access intimacy has existed. And in most of them, access intimacy was not instant, but built and cultivated, with me bearing the brunt of the work.
For the first time in my adult life, I am experiencing access intimacy that is not just painstakingly built over the years, conversation by conversation, but is already in fertile existence, ready to grow. For the first time in my life, I am in disabled community, meeting sick and disabled folks and experiencing a kind of mutual access intimacy that feels like family. For the first time in my life, I'm in relationships with able-bodied queer people of color, experiencing access intimacy that is beyond explanation and belief. For the first time this year, I am experiencing a level of access intimacy in my intimate relationships and home life that I've never experienced before. It has been both amazing and saddening, now having something that actually cares about me. And it, like emotional intimacy, is also a deep risk because it would be devastating to lose and requires maintenance. Now, when I describe relationships, I include access intimacy along with many other descriptors. I'm watching it, studying it, bearing witness to it as it grows, evolves, and shifts as I learn all the different ways that access intimacy can exist.
And that was it. Thank you to all our reading volunteers.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I guess I just wanted to point that this piece was published in 2011. So like this is kind of like around the height of the Occupy movement, when this idea of the 99% of 1% was emerging. And it was this moment, I mean, like, you know, like I mentioned, the Disability Justice Collective, which Miamingus is part of, you know, proposing this, the disability justice as a framework as well around that time as well. And I think, you know, all this work, these ideas, like I think it's important to know that they're like this scholarship has been yeah, I guess it's been within the disability community for a while, and I think this learning around care and how to support others is something that everybody's thinking about now, but has really been like a way of life and a means of survival for folks in the disability community for the longest time. So yeah, I wonder if people have any responses after hearing that piece, especially given our current situation.
I mean, I'll just speak while we wait for people to type. For me, something that has been on my mind quite a bit is looking at disabled Twitter and reading people's tweets that they can't, they don't want to bring their wheelchairs with them when they go to the hospital because it identify them as disabled, and then they don't think they'll get a ventilator. And that's something that I feel we're in this time where there's new access points, like having Zoom and working remotely, but we're still having difficulty giving everyone equal rights, which is something that I'm really been toying with.
Yeah. And talking, you know, I've heard conversations about like, how do we isolate people who are the most vulnerable and continue like with work and all these things, and, you know, lift some of these restrictions. And I was just thinking, like, I never had thought that, you know, as a disabled person advocate, focuses on accessibility, that I'd be thinking about, like, you know, that this was the focus of the disability movement in the late 60s of like trying to like claim visibility, like claim that access to public space and to public life and participating in public life, and now we're faced with a similar set of circumstances where people are, you know, thinking of how do you put that, where do you put that problem, so we could get back to life as usual.
And just note if you would like to, oh, I actually see a question right here. Someone says, it feels hard, if not impossible, to engage with institutions on an access intimacy level. How do you support yourself in facing these institutions / having your access needs recognized / hoping that people care about your work?
Yeah, it's hard because I feel like many folks in the disability community, like I hold institutional trauma from having to rely on institutions that have failed me throughout my life, and I've spent much time in hospital since I was a kid, and you know, feel like I still hold trauma from that, and I still go to the hospital. And well, I mean, that's my next point is I've actually like it's gotten to the point where I don't feel safe going to hospital when I'm in emergency sort of situation now, and so I'm working through that because of my distrust, and I really think it you know, it really depends on who's hosting you. And sometimes, I mean, especially in my early years practicing as an artist, these negotiations for support that I needed in order to do the job, to actually get to the place to do the work, like that was the most difficult. And I think those conversations are getting easier as I learn how to advocate for myself and make more connections with disabled folks who have to do this as well. But you know, it isn't easy, and I think you know, like disabled folks account for like they have like some of the least access to the cultural sector of any other minority group. There's been studies around, you know, employment, obviously, in Canada and elsewhere too, about disabled folks and their like severely limited access to meaningful employment. And so these issues, like, I mean, in our most yeah, like the institutions that we rely on that are you know, available for to the public, or to the ideas that they're available to the public, there's systemic barriers that disabled folks face, and that's present in the cultural sector and everywhere else. So I guess some of the strategies that I've adopted are, I mean, like, I haven't done this yet, but like I'm just about to like write an accessibility rider for like a rider of my requirements, accessibility requirements for accepting a contract. And you know, that's something that some disabled performers do. There are some guidelines online of how certain folks approach that, but it's really to just like, you know, like we need to, at the very basic level, like need these things in order to be able to do our job. And last year I interviewed like about 8 like pretty prominent disabled artists who had reached like mainstream platforms with their work. And I was asking them about like their experience working as an artist. Like, do they feel like they are supported in the ways that they need support? Do they feel like the places that they work are accessible? And, you know, I mean, every artist was saying that accessibility is very poor, and also the state of conversation disability in the landscape period. And you know, we really just have, I think, we have to establish new cultural standards for accessibility, beyond a policy that's just kind of people are trying to comply with. It has, I think, like access intimacy, it needs to be something that is elusive. It needs to be something that is that people are building together, and it changes over time. And that can't really happen unless you build trust with the person that's bringing you in, if you are entering from the outside or a marginal position.
And I have another question here, Carmen, and just a note for people, you can either type in the Q&A box or you can raise your hand and either me and Duncan can let you speak. So someone says, it is something I related to greatly when I first fell back. It is something I find that non-disabled stand. I find this plays out in life. However, I notice it even more during challenging times. Quote, my people might get through, who get me through, and I in turn carry them. Working in a large institution where I do not experience access intimacy with any staff has been challenging. How do we bring this into the art world at the institutional level?
Yeah, I feel like it's really adopting a new set of standards, like establishing new standards and practices for accessibility beyond a policy model. I think we can't really just rely on a government to decide what a basic level of service for people who are like experience multiple barriers should have. Like that, I mean, I think of accessibility that's the result of policy as maybe like a government's like, best effort to establish a standard of care. But it's only one way of of delivering that to a wider public. I think there's various things that people do in community with each other, especially at a grassroots level, that represent what I'm talking about, that represent accessibility as a living practice. A lot of organizations that are active in the downtown East Side neighborhood in Vancouver, who are offering like frontline services as well as opportunities for art education and creative development as well, because I think these needs, these survival-based needs, can't be separated from the need to develop one's practice, to represent oneself through art practice. So within larger institutions, I think it's a critical time right now. I think it's really, I'm really worried actually, because just before last year, like there was the passing of Bill C-81, which is called the Accessible Canada Act, and the whole idea was to establish this precedent setting legislation for accessibility that would serve as like a new standard for accessibility. But I mean, like this legislation is really not doing much to address that culture of ableism, and I think that's the piece that's really missing. And I think usually, I when something is off or not working, when it comes for disabled folks, it's often as a result of an ableist uh, premise, practice, like these traditions that we just carry over and don't question. But still, I think as much as we try to make welcoming spaces for folks, like we really, I think at this moment, really need to do what we can to unlearn ableism, and like identify how it affects folks, but also like address things that like I think what was really striking for me when following the Accessible Canada campaign and the legislation and everything is that there wasn't really mention of like the effects of colonization, or like even like locally. Well, in BC now, all these provinces too are responding to Accessible Canada and establishing their own legislation provincially. And like in BC, like we don't have conversations about the really recent histories where institutions have perpetrated violence under the guise of care, like, you know, the mass institutionalization of folks who you know, require mental health support. In BC alone, like we have, like it was only in the 70s that that forced sterilization programs were ended. So these are pretty recent histories that really kind of, you think about like the just the relations between disabled and non-disabled people, or like people requiring support and people delivering support, and there's just like this history that needs to, like, that we need to come to terms with, and I think model new relationships around care, you know, and I think this whole landscape needs to be defined by people who with lived experience of disability, or people who are experience the barriers that are trying to be addressed. It just can't, we can't just use a set of policies that kind of came out, like where a lot of the recommendations for that come out of policy for accessibility are ways of like retrofitting access. It's a way to like invite participation in a system or in a situation, a space that was built without the person in mind that needs that accommodation. So, you know, an accommodation I often say is like a temporary bridge to participation. If it wasn't available, the place would not be accessible. So I think we have to build new systems from the grassroots, from the ground up, and around a radically different set of parameters, and think more like creatively about accessibility.
So it's 2:30. There's another question. Should I go with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So this person was talking about in the early 90s, the city of Kamloops had the Mayor's Committee on Accessibility, and they were just wondering, do you know of any other place today that might have such a committee for learning about accessibility needs and support in our museum world?
In the museum world, I know there's a few groups that are trying to develop new frameworks for these things, to like set new cultural standards for accessibility that can be shared across institutions. Some of this work's being done through the Rubin Foundation in New York City and the 8th Floor Gallery. I mean, locally, I know Tangled Arts and Disability put out like this toolkit, accessibility toolkit, a few years ago. There's various organizations that like are dedicated to this topic. But in terms of advisory committees, I know that the city, they do have a disability advisory committee that, like, you know, kind of speaks on various topics and informs this for certain projects that are happening through the city. I know the Portland Art Museum recently implemented accessibility advisory council as well. And in New York City, there's also the Museum Access Consortium as well. That's a group that kind of meets together around the topic of accessibility, and from various like leading arts institutions in New York.
Sorry, Carmen, just a clarifying point. The person said the diversity of accessibility needs was the important aspect of that message. So,
oh, the diversity of needs.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know if there's. I think it's pretty codified usually. Like we have. There's not enough of those kinds of approaches to accessibility around. I think certain times when you know, I would say like the Tangled Arts and Disability, like the folks who put together that toolkit, you know, really embrace disability justice sort of approach. So I would say any like intersectional sort of approach to accessibility that's really kind of centering folks that are underrepresented, because like usually like disability folk centered spaces are white and male. And so we still have to do work within our community to center folks that and perspectives and intersections that don't often get space and time. So I think that's the main problem is, we really have to embrace, I think, that disability justice framework or an approach to accessibility. So we are considering these other these intersections with other forms of oppression and with other communities as well. But no, not often, not too many examples out there.
Go on.
Oh, I was going to say the next thing on our schedule is a sound piece. We're going to have to see how that comes through to everybody. It's about a 12-minute piece, and it's actually highlights from interviews that I conducted a couple of years ago with folks who work in the downtown east side neighborhood and Chinatown. And again, I guess I really wanted to share this because it was a lot of these interviews were done before Vancouver implemented its own cultural plan. The city of Vancouver released this 10-year sort of cultural plan that kind of talks about where cultural funding will go and what will be prioritized, and really it is built around the idea of equity and inclusion, and it's called Culture Shift. So before this whole cultural plan was going on, I was talking to a lot of folks who work in grassroots organizations about the work that they do, how they serve their communities, how they practice accessibility, really to explore the politics of support within these communities, and maybe conversations that often get missed when maybe governments or cities or city departments discuss accessibility and how to open that up.
Okay, I'll share my screen and then I'll play the audio.
I'm gonna mute mine.
If we think about disability history and the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, for many, that was the first time that there was a mass movement to venture out or to find a way out of institutions being institutionalized, and some of the first ways to participate in public space. And accessibility has been a project that has been pretty much contained within policy. The ways and the dynamics set up by policy-based models for accessibility have really modeled relationships between people who need care and need support and people who have resources and can deliver those things.
Even the way we're speaking right now, it's not going to be accessible to a bunch of folks. And I'm really sensitive about that. I have some of this language that I've learned in community, and for a while I wasn't trying to pass myself off as someone who had post-secondary education, but I've been in situations where people thought, oh, this person has accessed academia, and that sort of becoming a weird shortcut for folks in their mind that, okay, that means Ali is better equipped to talk about not only my own experiences, but those of others, and just this idea that there's the right way to talk about this stuff. It makes me super uncomfortable and really confused.
Calamity is an amazing activist organizer that I work with, and they're always when you go into a space, whose bodies fit into the chairs?
Right.
Who did they have in mind when they made these spaces, right?
Yeah. How's the public space, so-called public space, oriented? Who's it oriented for?
There's a lot of spaces in the downtown east side where certain people don't feel very comfortable going in. So, and other people are saying, well, I don't understand why, because the door's open, sort of.
especially bigger organizations who just think like, well, it's free, so everybody can just come. And it's like, that's actually not enough. Like, your event is on the other side of town, what they do is they're starting to realize, oh, we wanted to have it for those folks. And then, so they'll call up Carnegie or something. Hey, can you bring all those people over? Not addressing the fact that actually that costs money for them to do all that.
We have a decision-making structure that is intended for participants of the space to be able to make decisions about how the space runs. And most of the people who are on the collective are folks who've been marginalized because of mental health stuff. I find that that's a radical proposition, which is like, it shouldn't be radical. That like someone with like a group of people with a mental health diagnosis are able to like make decisions about finances and hiring and firing and like programming and whatever. Like, that's how it should be. Like, even other organizations that are similar to Gachet, where there's like art and mental health or art and disability, oftentimes they're like more of a service provision model, like a day program for people to come and make art, or like physically located inside of psychiatric institutions. And the people whose artwork is being shown are like incarcerated there, basically. So it's a pretty unique model in a lot of ways. And the assumption that we try to begin with is that everyone has the capability to like make decisions and to take responsibility for their community and try to support that,
Speaking like for myself and my embodiments, the sexism and misogyny that I experience is rooted in ableism, because women's brains are smaller and we're weaker and we don't have the capacity to have any type of meaningful conversation. And that's by virtue of our physical bodies, our biology, and that idea of ableism. And then also my queerness and my transness. There's something wrong with this person's brain for them to think that they could exist outside of this binary, or that they could exist in a way that is not in line with the hetero patriarchal cis way of existing. And then also racism, that's rooted in ableism too. It's like this idea that there are inferior races of people, and so and white supremacy completely operates. It could not exist without ableism. Ableism is like all of these fucked up systems' best friend, and it's their go-to. It seems to always go back to the body, and how all these bodies are different from this one type of body. It means everyone is. It means the majority of the world is disabled. The majority of the world is incapable and not worth as much, doesn't deserve happiness, survival, to thrive, access.
Like at Gachet, I feel like it's trying to define what accessibility means at Gachet is kind of hard, because it means things that haven't happened yet. It's holding a space that's responsive to what happens in it and who's there at the time.
The idea that someone out of the blue can't come to facilitate or help with a workshop because they're having a bad mental health day and they can't come, then trying to like, okay, we need to always have a backup person, or these things that I hadn't really thought of before. And like, okay, well, we need to put these in place in how we work, because that's just the reality of the people we work with and who we want to support. And then also not make them feel bad that they can't make it. It's like, that's fine, no problem. We have backup for you. It's not a stressful situation. We're trying to make that work too. So.
We're sustained through grants, right? So like, we need somebody who can like write grants that make sense to funders, to government, to foundations, someone who understands the legal, somebody who understands bookkeeping, somebody who understands those things. And I think that like members of our collective do understand those things, but sometimes part of being labeled as having a disability or having a mental illness is like that you've got cycles to your life, where there are certain times where you just can't do stuff. And when you're writing grants to survive as an organization, you're operating as somebody else's rhythm. Like, you know, it's an institution's rhythm. It's not the rhythm of your community. And so you know, you need folks who are able to kind of bridge both of those worlds.
I don't know, like when you hear that Accessible Canada is hoping to be an innovative approach to legislation around accessibility right now, like nothing about it, it talks about being more, like repercussions being harsher for people who don't employ these policies, which is like, yeah, how are you going to model good relationships between people who need support and people who are providing if, you know, it's based on enforcement?
If we're really thinking about like supporting disabled artists and like disabled folks, it's like, it's not just like helping them get their art thing done, right? It's about the bigger interdependency piece of like, how are folks gonna get their dinner tonight, and how are folks gonna drive to their medical appointment? So it's such a it's a bigger picture thing of like that community container of support, right?
I can be in a room and understand every word a person is saying, but I can also be somewhere completely different, or I get stuck on a couple of words. Like I understand the words, but I don't understand what they're saying. And I find it can be really difficult to engage in that way and, you know, make space for myself to say, could you repeat the question? Or I don't understand. But a lot of the time, you know, I kind of just have to pretend that I understand what's being said. And I don't see that as, you know, anything negative about myself. It's just, you know, people exist on different planes.
People aren't going to come to this thing if there is no food, for example, let's say, whatever. You've thought of certain things because you know from the past that, like, people are like, I got to go stand in a food lineup, I can't come to this thing, or I got to go wait for my shelter, I can't come to this thing. So you learn on a daily basis of like, oh man, what the challenges people are facing. And so we're trying to make it formalized. Yeah, we're trying to write that into the money. If we are doing a project, we're trying to get enough money to cover all these things that include as much as that as we've thought of beforehand. Of course, once the thing starts, you're like, oh, we forgot that we didn't think about people who need this kind of help to make sure they come in. And so either you have to scramble around and rejig your budget, or think, okay, we can't do it this time, so next time we got to make sure we add that as a thing. And I think that's part of this whole learning process about like, what does that even mean, accessibility? It's almost impossible to think of all the things before the thing starts. And I think in some ways too, we're a little bit naive, like because we're so new, and we're like, well, we'll just do this. And then you're like, in hindsight, it's like, oh, you know what we should have done. And so it's really a big learning process, I think.
And I feel like this is an accessibility thing, right? Because a lot of us are dealing with PTSD and different kinds of trauma, and it's like just connecting with people with gentleness, connecting with people with the benefit of the doubt that if they can't come, or if things are coming up, that it's not that they hate me, or that it's not personal, that it's like they are dealing with their stuff. And to really step outside of how I've been socialized in that way, and to be like, they're doing what they need to take care of themselves, as opposed to like they hate me or they're mad at me or something. And if that stuff comes up, to also be able to talk about that stuff. And that's really different from how I grew up and what I know. So I feel like that's a way that we are thinking about accessibility and are caring about each other in a really heart-centered way. Yeah.
That sounds like a practice that's ongoing, and that it's not like a job that's ever over. And it seems to also be guided by your beliefs and like what you hold to be true. And I don't know, like there's a politics about it seems.
And like what would make a space welcoming to a marginalized person? Well, it's like an oxymoron. Like, I need to not be marginalized.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening and experiencing that. I also, yeah, we have until the end of the meeting, just time for open discussion and reflection and response to what we've been talking about and listening to.
And we do have a question from previously too that we can,
Okay.
if you'd like to speak to that first. Or,
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just trying to summarize this question.
Uh-huh.
So the statement came from reading the I want statements. Some of the statements seem to describe opposite wants. So in terms of logistics of setting up an event or activity so that it is accessible to everyone with all their complex needs, it seems like you could potentially be confronting with a situation where there are opposing needs. I was wondering if you have dealt with this, how to support folks with seemingly opposed needs. I can imagine there's several solutions along the lines of shifting your own perspective. But I'm specifically wondering how you have approached this possible issue in the past, or you might have learned from past experiences.
I feel like most of the time, accessibility is so limited that you're not accommodating enough needs for there to be a conflict. And so I would say that when it comes to whether we try to accommodate very subjective individual needs in a room and try, so that I want statements that this person posing the question was referring to as a list of statements that kind of came out of my process with the group from Gallery Gachet that audited the Vancouver Art Gallery. And everybody was asked sort of what conditions must be in place for them to feel welcome at the Vancouver Art Gallery or for them to thrive as an artist. And so they came up with a series of I want statements that kind of just like represented everything from, I want people in positions of power to be poor, sick, and trans persons of color, to I want the Vancouver Art Gallery to stop charging over $20 for admission. And they really kind of spoke to specific needs, and some of them, were could be potentially in conflict. When we were posing these I wants, it was to sort of like develop a framework for how to assess the Vancouver Art Gallery, and these are a lot of these considerations fall like way outside of the frameworks that we typically use to, gauge whether something is accessible or not. And, some of them went into personal preference, some of them went into, politics, and various things like that. In a few events that I've hosted, I can think of, there's like, who's in the, I think I would privilege giving access to people over limiting, like, I would say let's deal with the conflicts when they arise. And if you have a situation where you're accommodating people's individual needs and there's a potential conflict and you're in that situation, I think you're doing pretty good in terms of accessibility. And then that's like the next, like we can address those conflicts once we get there. That is an issue though, like that is a common problem. And I think there's a lot of there's folks discourse around this about conflicting accessibility, but I think if we're broadening what accessibility means and what the responsibility of the institution is, where to dedicate those resources to, I think we're probably approaching accessibility more holistically, and maybe shouldn't be like worrying about potential conflicts. Although those, it's very relevant, and of course we can address those when they do pop up.
I've experienced personally like for me, something accessible is providing food, but people who have very severe allergies or severe sense, the smelling in particular. So with that, you know, just again, communicating to people and learning that certain veggies are really great to have, and maybe that won't be as bad for people's allergies or sensitivities.
And always, like, if you need to problem solve around these kinds of things and you need to consult with like a community member, someone with lived experience, like, I mean, it's always best to talk to the person who's using the service or using, you know, requires the accommodation and or has the lived experience. And, you know, ideally, you know, if the institution or organization is going to benefit or be better for, you know, after that consultation, like, they definitely should be compensating the person that's offering that perspective, because I think that's part of the, like, the project of accessibility is yeah, is realizing like all these dimensions of accessibility and how, like, I mean, there's so much extra labor on folks who are disabled, in just like scaffolding for their own accessibility and advocating for themselves and for other people too that can't show up, who are in their community because of the state of access. So like, I think anything that folks can do, if they do have access to a platform, access to a budget, resources, you know, we need to find ways to address that systemic inequality, I think. And if we're doing that, and thinking creatively about how to do that, I think this is what I'm really talking about approaching accessibility as a living practice, an ongoing negotiation. You know, what does it mean to like hold accessible space? That's going to be different in every community and in every context. So I think it's really like intentionally starting a conversation about that and then building on that as well, through like actions and yeah, and real investment.
And it looks like we have a couple questions and a person raising their hands, but maybe just I'll limit to one because we're running out of time here.
Okay.
So a person asks, I wonder about these kinds of joyful access we can find and what experiences you have had been heartfelt and exciting and finding new ways to care for each other. I'm hoping at least that one thing that comes out of this pandemic is learning to understand how empowering and powerful it is to learn to care for each other.
That's a great place to, yeah, I'd love to speak on that. And I think the thing that's been really hopeful for me through this all has been the mutual aid efforts that have emerged, and have people just, you know, letting others know, like, this is what I can offer, and, you know, people feeling like they can actually say what they need and disclose in various situations. And I think that's hopeful, like, you know, people coming together to shop for each other, to provide counseling, all these things. But joyful accessibility, I think a lot of exciting work is happening within the disability arts movement. And I think there's a lot of artists that address accessibility creatively, because of whether for their own survival and well-being, or just because it's a topic that they're excited about. One really great local example that I love is, and that I got to experience last summer actually, it was called Fingerworks for Fireworks, and it was presented by Vocal Eye Descriptive Arts, which is an organization here in Vancouver that provides live visual description mostly at theater events. So like, they try to give visual context, the visual context that the low vision or blind person watching would be missing, and they try to find points in the performance to deliver this information where there's no dialogue, or where there's like a lull or something like that. And so they usually do that kind of work, but they were working with this one artist who's kind of doesn't really consider himself an artist, named Colin Van Uchelen, and he's a blind adult who developed this method for interpreting the fireworks displays in Vancouver. So, you know, we have this tradition of the celebration of light in August. There's, you know, various countries kind of competing who has the best fireworks display. Colin has always had a passion for fireworks, and as his vision was declining, he found different ways to keep that experience meaningful for him, and eventually landed on this method for his friends to both describe the fireworks to him, the color, movement, and shape, but also to like make these like like these impressions on his hand, arm, and back that kind of represent the shape and the movement of the fireworks as well. And over time, he kind of developed this program with Vocal Eye Descriptive Arts, where they like did this training program on how to describe the fireworks, both like, you know, through just verbal description, but then also through these tactile like hand articulations, and they've been offering these kind of like this program for the last, I think, just 5 years, and so you kind of just like sit and watch the fireworks and have someone behind you. It's a one-on-one experience, and they kind of just like are describing the display subjectively while impressing on your back. And I felt like it was such a, like, I'm usually really skeptical about accessibility programs. And I'm like, okay, who's designed this experience for me? And, you know, were they a person with lived experience? I'm usually not consulted on the things that I experience that are, you know, that are available to me, you know, in a museum context, for example. But like this fireworks display was like so different, and it was so moving. And I felt like it almost like elevated the experience in a way that wasn't available to like the 100,000 people that were also just like taking in it with their visual sense. So that's one like great example that I could think of that's pretty local here. I also think, I mean, I love bringing this example up. There was this reading series called Reverb, a queer reading series that ran for a few years here in Vancouver. They usually ran out of Gallery Gachet. It was $1 to participate, or a sliding scale. It was really intended to, you know, the whole purpose of the project was to make space for queer poets of color. And they kind of just made this commitment to adopt a new accessibility protocol every month that they met. So, you know, they ran for about 7 years, and at the end of their run, at their final event, like they just would take requests from their community and then do the work to implement that accessibility protocol by the next event. And I had the chance of hosting them for their last event in 2015, and there was like over 100 people that showed up for a poetry event in the middle, you know, on a weekend in the afternoon, which was amazing itself. But also there was just like the room was just kind of alive with all of these accessibility practices, from, you know, ASL to transcription and graphic recording, and all of these things that came through recommendations from their public. And it just kind of grew into this project about accessibility, but at its heart, it was this project to make space for underrepresented poets. So I love that example as well. And I think that's just an amazing approach to accessibility that can evolve over time as well.
Well, thank you so much, Carmen, for taking all this time with us, and thank you all for joining us, especially to Duncan, who has also been monitoring the chat, to Michelle, Lino, and Joshua for volunteering to read with us. And just to note that on Monday, April 27th, Carmen will be joining us again with Parker Johnson, who is a Victoria-based facilitator, to have a community conversation to think about futurisms in art. Do you have anything else to add, Carmen?
No, I guess I would like to promote to Unsettling Dramaturgy, which is a convening of like disabled and indigenous artists that I'm part of. You could find Unsettling Dramaturgy on Facebook, and we're hosting like these Zoom praxis sessions in the next few weeks too. And there's a couple archived online that you can find too. And really the idea is to, we've been meeting for over a year on Zoom, just thinking through like various ways of gathering in a good way across communities, across boundaries and borders. And yeah, check that out. And everybody, thank you for the time. You know, hopefully we have the opportunity to be in a room someday together and get further into these topics. I look forward to everybody chatting to everybody soon, and be safe.